We are in the middle of the supply chain disruption, and one of the questions that we'll look at in this coming panel is issues about just-in-time and nearshoring, as Jarrod mentioned. Many years ago, 25 years ago, I actually managed a small business unit. Lots of us at ILP have industry backgrounds, and this business unit was about making things, and I had P&L responsibility. There was a line in the cost section of the P&L for carrying costs for materials, and it was small, and I never worried about it because it never changed, because our manufacturing manager was really good. I'm wondering, and I'm hoping that my colleague Yuri will ask this question, what do manufacturing managers do today when the carrying cost line triples or quadruples? I'm wondering what their bosses say. It's something I never had to deal with, but in this new disruptive environment, I think things like that are what all of you are having to deal with. So with that, I will introduce my colleague, Yuri Ramos, a fellow program director here in the Industrial Liaison Program. He will be moderating this panel on supply chain disruptions. Yuri, to you.
Thank you. I'll take it. Hello, everybody. My name is Yuri Ramos, as Ron said. Thanks for the kind intro, Ron. I'm a program director with the ILP, and I'll be happy and honored to moderate the panel today. And hi to all of you, and we have a few hundreds of people attending this conference online. So if that's the camera, hi everybody. I do have a cost-related questions, as you mentioned, Ron. Not exactly this, and which will be to Erez. Erez, be ready. I have a nice question for you coming very soon. So we're coming to the very end of this very nice conference. Thanks again for being here. And disruption, we're talking about supply chain. Supply chain, which has been, really badly disrupted, especially in the last, say, couple of years. Industry segment companies, nations, the way we do business have been disrupted. Given the pandemic, we're still kind of going through. We're much better shape now. And if that is not enough, then it comes the conflict in Europe, also impacting a lot of companies, industries, and unfortunately, people. Computer chips, exercise equipment, breakfast cereal, cars. Ron mentioned in the beginning, cars. As you know, the world has run short of many products. You folks certainly remember, sounds like long ago, but it was not that long ago, when we had a hard time buying face masks. You may remember, this was only 2 years ago. And now, Jarrod just mentioned, so there are some companies which have tons of face masks, they don't know what to do with them. Airplanes getting delayed while waiting for food to be delivered. According to McKinsey, and this I have to read carefully, supply chain disruptions cost the average organization 40% of 1 year's profit over the course of a decade. Key questions we'd love to address and discuss today with this amazing panel. How can businesses manage risk and plan for a more resilient future? What have we learned with the crisis seen in the last 2 years? Is there a holy grail for supply chain resilience? To discuss these questions and many others, including those that please send us questions to Pigeonhole, you online too. Let me introduce you to our amazing panelists. Let me start with Professor Václav Levy. Professor Levy is a professor of operations management at the MIT Sloan School of Management. He's a member of the operations management group at Sloan and affiliated with the Operations Research Center. Professor Levy's current research is focused on the design of analytical data-driven decision support models and tools addressing complex business and system design decisions under uncertainty in areas such as health, healthcare management, procurement, inventory management, revenue management, pricing optimization, and voila, supply chain. I'll introduce you now to our next panelist. You've just been introduced to Jarrod, but let me do it again. Dr. Jarrod Goentzel is a founder and director of the MIT Humanitarian Supply Chain Lab in the MIT Center for Transportation and Logistics, or our CTL. His research focuses on meeting human needs in resource-constrained settings through better supply chain management, information systems, and decision support technology. Dr. Goentzel leads field work in a range of contexts to develop insights that improve response efforts during emergencies, like he mentioned, Hurricane Irma and Maria, and strengthen supply chain in vulnerable communities. And lastly, we have then 2 MIT faculty members and an expert from the industry. Erez Agmoni is the Senior Vice President of Innovation and Strategic Growth for Maersk in North America. In his current role, Dr. Agmoni is managing departments including industrial real estate, product development, engineering design, and maintenance. He also manages Maersk Innovation Center, which contains 3 legs: R&D, digital transformation, and data science. Dr. Agmoni has a broad industry experience of more than 25 years in supply chain management, freight forward, logistics, engineering, and digital innovation, which he utilized to develop complex solutions that improve end-to-end supply chains. This was a question that I prepared for the panel, the 3 panelists. Let me start with you, and then Jarrod and Ratsef, feel free to jump in. And it has to do with the cost that my colleague Ron just mentioned. So everybody wants a resilient supply chain. Who does not? Everybody does. However, it comes with a cost, and the cost is very high. So then imagine, Erez, when we're back to quote-unquote normal, then your CFO gives you a call. Erez, would you mind stopping by? Calls from CFOs and HR, don't get them. They're not good usually. So you get a call from your CFO, who would then ask you about, okay, we're resilient, but this whole thing, this new supply chain we implemented is costing a lot of money. The question is then, after we're back to normal, will memories fade and economics will trump concerns about national vulnerabilities?
Great question. Yeah. So definitely people have short memories. I agree with you, especially when you have gap between a disaster or some disruption to disruption. But what we see in the last 5-10 years, you have a disruption constantly. This is really the only constant that you have is change and disruption. And if it's not a COVID, it's a volcano. If it's not a volcano, it's a tsunami. If it's not a tsunami, it's something else. There is always something going on. So I think that the last 2 years, because it lasts that long, I think it will have a better print on the memory of at least for the next 5 to 10 years. And I think people maybe will slow down and take 1 or 2 steps back, but they will not go back to the normal of everything will be fine. We can work with that. So it's a mixed field.
Got it. Thank you. Any comments, Ratsef?
Yeah, I think that the notion of disruptions is not new. I think that the last 2 years were providing an extreme example that impacted at scale simultaneously many industries. But if you look on past years, let's just pick healthcare, the healthcare industry. We had years here that we were in shortage of some of the most critical drugs, and there was a global shortage. So the notion of disruptions is not new. I think companies, when you think about companies and how they operate, there's a set of sources of uncertainties that they assume as part of their steady state operating system, and they prepare measures to mitigate and manage. For example, if you take an airline company, weather uncertainty is definitely something that airline companies have a range of sensing systems and measures how to manage. So clearly, what the steady state would be like would be updated, as Erez suggested. But I still think that it doesn't take away a deeper issue here, which is to what extent companies understand the boundaries of their operating scheme. So I think every company has some boundaries and some enabling conditions that once they are disrupted, you essentially need to operate under irregular operations. And that's a very important concept, the concept of irregular operations and how companies are prepared for that is something that is still, I suspect, still going to be something that many companies will have to learn and adapt to. And there are 3 aspects to be able to manage irregular operations. First of all is to be able to know what the boundaries are. And I think that many companies operate completely, or at least to a large degree, blinded to what the boundaries of their enabling conditions are. so that's one thing, is have a collective awareness of that and sensing systems that you will even know that you are about to hit irregular operations. Then you need to have a plan. But then the really interesting issue is what kind of design features you implement into your steady state system to make you more resilient and robust to be able to transition relatively smoothly from regular operations to irregular operations. And here, I think there are actually surprising insights. Once you start to think about it systematically, the perception that the cost is prohibited is not always true. And there are many examples that just a little bit, just enough flexibility in your system, in strategically chosen design parameters, can actually provide you a great deal of robustness and resilience. And this is something that we teach in many of the courses here at MIT, and this is usually a powerful insights for managers and practitioners to understand that actually there is something they can do and still remain competitive in steady state, but nevertheless gain a lot of resilience. So I think there is a fundamental concept here of irregular operations versus regular operations. The definitions might shift based on the last 2 years, but I don't think that we are going to completely forget about these challenges.
Yeah. Humans like to define the boundaries and operating in something that they feel they have control over. And so how do you adapt those boundaries, and when do you incorporate new information to define a new steady state where it's not as steady as it was before? And so I think it's difficult to, once you define that state, then you have to figure out how you're going to make investments once you define the new state. And so I think you're seeing examples of people expanding the state a little bit. Like I said, in our work with hospitals in Massachusetts, there was already, even with the Hurricane Maria, caused significant supply issues with saline because of manufacturing capability on the island. So that already caused some hospitals to start exploring, well, maybe we need to have a bit better direct relationship with our suppliers, because that's something that we might see happen again. And those hospitals that started that road were very happy during the pandemic that they had expanded their state a little bit based on one experience. And so then once they did that, now there's more incentive. Now they're really looking to go more aggressively in this, and the CFO is buying on that. Other hospitals had not defined it that way, and then they're hearing the pressure from the CFO that, well, this is capital investment to keep these stockpiles. And so it depends on how you define the state. And the investments that are not quite as expensive, a lot of times, it's just human investment and helping the human start to think about how they might operate when they're outside of the steady state, and explore whether it's worth expanding the boundaries or not. I always like to give an example in the old maps that used to have dragons on them. They would paint dragons on the oceans because they knew that it was not safe to sail there, but they didn't know why. They just didn't want to go there, right? So they will drag on it, and they wouldn't worry about it. They would just sail around it. And I think a lot of times with major disruptions, we tend to want to, let's put a dragon on it, we won't plan for it. But those dragons are showing up more in our operations. And so, being willing to venture occasionally into uncharted waters, even if you're not acting on it with investments for the CFO, if you're taking your human planning capability to say what would happen in those uncharted waters, it helps you know when and how you might expand the boundaries and still be profitable and not have it be a financial hit. So that exploration of uncharted waters is, I think, the best kind of investments to be making, and incrementally building resilience as you learn about the ocean and all of its complexities. So.
Thank you. So, and still sticking to cost-related, issue, let's have a question, which I'd love you, Erez, I'd love your take on this question. We were talking there, this question I prepared for Retzef, but I'd love to have your take on this question, which is, Retzef, how to improve availability versus cost minimization in a volatile supply chain?
Yeah, I think that, again, I would distinguish between what I would call steady state uncertainty and, for example, many companies deal with steady state uncertainty in demand. They have different mitigation strategies, from having multiple suppliers to having some inventory in place. So that's one domain of issues. The other domain of issues is, again, what happens when your system is going to be stressed. And I think that in order to decide where are you vulnerable, and then what can you do about this, you have to actively stress your system. You have to actively understand where the boundaries of your system, of your regular operation scheme are, so you will be able to identify what types of disruptions are going to expose you, and what kind of disruptions are maybe things that you are able to handle more smoothly with your current capabilities. And there are many things that you can do, but at the high level, you can divide what you can do into 2 or 3 domains. The first domain is be able to survive over a longer period of time given the disruption until the disruption disappears, right? So for example, if you have 3 months of inventory, so you can probably sustain a disruption of supply of 3 months, right? Another domain of activities you can have is to be able to recover faster, right? So if you're able to find alternative supply sources quickly, that means that that gives you flexibility to address the disruption. And then the third domain is to manage the exposure. So for example, there, if you have good relationships with your customers and you are able, for example, to potentially postpone delivery times, that's another domain. Now, what is the best strategy is really context dependent. But the problem is that companies should not think about it when it happens. They should have at least a sense of where the vulnerabilities are and what are the portfolio of strategies that they want to use. And I think that the problem is, and maybe to some extent I build on what was just said, is early detection is really key here. And sometimes it's a matter of hours, and sometimes it's a matter of days, and sometimes it's a matter of weeks. But if you're able to detect the problem a week before your competitors, that might gain you a huge competitive edge, right? And sometimes it's just a few hours before the competitors, right? So I think that the way to view that is it's not a one-dimensional type of interventions. It's a portfolio, but it starts with diagnostic that is based on stressing your systems and understand where it's vulnerable. What disruptions are going to put you in a state where your current playbook is not going to work anymore, and you need a different playbook.
Okay, takes from the industry.
Sure. So I think what Recep mentioned is definitely a lot of good points here. I want to take a little bit more in-depth to the supply chain itself approach and look back how the supply chain, until COVID happened, how the supply chain was managed by manufacturers and suppliers, etc. It was very much transactional type of relationship, maybe except for custom brokerage, so the custom clearance, or maybe the contract logistics, which included the warehousing. These are much longer term kind of relationship and contract. Everything else was very transactional. Even if you have a 1-year contract, it was not honored. I'll give an example, of course, it's easy for me from the ocean freight as an ocean carrier. You might have a large relationship with 1 or 2 or 3, 4 carriers. You normally sign a contract with them, and then either you supply what you promised, or you suddenly go and shop in the market and find better rates. That's by itself, this transactional relationship, it's already causing a disruption and a relationship that cannot help you in times of problems. You need partnerships to be formed around supply chain if you want your supply chain to be much more resilient. Something that started during COVID, people realized, hey, that doesn't work. Now, there's much more partnership around that nowadays. There's much longer contract, which is a good start. But I think we definitely need to take it to the next level. Instead of prescribe how you move the cargo for each of your vendors, so you please take it from A to B, you take it from B to C, now take it from C to D. What needs to be done is much more into the end-to-end look at things. When you put one provider, and it doesn't matter who is that provider, if you put one provider responsible for an end-to-end, they can easily recover from problems along the supply chain by taking some steps in the next step of the supply chain and the next move of that. Let me give you an example. Just before COVID, about 2 years before COVID, I did a research on our own internal data that we have from customers. I took 1 million shipments between China and the US. And I was like looking, how is the transit times looks like? Because everybody cares about, yeah, it has to come fast, it has to come fast. Then what I discovered, it was mainly to the Midwest of the US. It was not to the east, to the West Coast, it was mainly to the Midwest. And what I discovered is that the transit time from the readiness at the port until it's arrived at DC in the Midwest of the US was 34 days till 74 days. Now, how can you design a supply chain when you have 40 days accordion there that you have no clue it will come 34 or 74? Of course, it was quite a nice bell curve around that numbers, but you can't even design yourself to the middle of the pack because you still want to produce and able to give the customers the ability to get the product on time. So you start buying a lot of safety stock, you fill up your inventories. Normally, most customers of ours telling us that they're doing it anyway from the 90 to the 97%. I don't think anybody is doing it to the 100%. So you kind of planning your whole supply chain on the problems that it may bring to you. So to the 60-something, 70 days of transit time between these 2 points. Now, of course, COVID came, and that 34 to 74 is probably now 74 to 150 or even more. I didn't research it recently. But that's definitely a problem. Now, bringing it back to an end-to-end, basically you can start hold your suppliers responsible. I need it in 50 days. I don't need it at the fastest time of 34. It's okay. As long as I can bring it with a window of 3 ± 3 days, so you have a short 1 week window of exceptions, you can take it as a 50 days and let them route it as they wish instead of going route step by step and bringing it. I think that's definitely can bring much more stability and much more resilience in terms of supply chain. Of course, it doesn't take into account things like Erez mentioned of could you have problems as the manufacturers cannot deliver goods, et cetera. But at least from the moment the cargo ready until it's arrived, this is something that can help tremendously to change the supply chain.
Thank you. Jarrod, speaking on response to crisis, since you're an expert, and let's think about, say again, face masks. Who imagines that we would need like 6 billion masks or so? How to adapt when these emergency management response, when the response, that's something that you expected to last weeks, a couple months, last like many months or years. How to adapt to something that you didn't see when it comes to the response, to the emergency response?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, Erez mentioned before about playbooks, and a lot of emergency managers think in that way of we have scenarios and what's our playbook. There's a lot of planning in the government on what play they're going to run. But they often think about the response as being a time-bounded event, right? Actually, Hurricane Maria was a bit of an eye-opener that there hadn't been a lot of planning for a protracted power outage on the island, in a situation, because most of the time the recovery in a disaster of the electric grid is pretty quick. Actually, that's one of the better response capabilities across the private sector is the ability to have mutual aid in companies to repair the grid. But in Puerto Rico, the grid maintenance was in a situation where it was difficult to restore. That then helped them think, our horizon may need to change in terms of thinking about what is response. How long are we going to be responding? Because as I mentioned before, like a Cascadian earthquake in the Pacific Northwest would likely make the Pacific Northwest an island cut off from power for an extensive period of time. So extended power outages are the biggest threat we have to our economy and to supply chains. And so they started thinking about it because they had an experience. How do you have people start thinking about something they haven't experienced? That's what's difficult, is to, what is a protracted outage like? I do think that's where the pandemic in some ways has been, if we don't take advantage of learning from this experience, what does it mean to have protracted stress and disruption, then we haven't done our job. This is an opportunity to start exploring how we adapt over a longer period of time, and not just do what I mentioned before, the hold your breath approach. Well, it'll get fixed soon. So we need to be thinking about that. And that's the kind of outside the boundary, sailing into the areas of the ocean where there's dragons that you need to do occasionally so you can think about what would we do in that scenario, and then the boundary conditions are not as scary to explore. Even if you don't implement a solution immediately, you've thought about what it would be like to adapt in more of those crises. So.
Yeah, I want to bring 3 points that are relevant to the discussion we just had. The first one, I think that one big issue here is even transparency to the supply chain. I think for many products, I don't think we even have visibility where the product is coming from. We did some study. For example, we found out that 90% of the imports of gloves, surgical gloves into the US, which is another item that was in shortage, was coming from three plants in Thailand. Now, there are 2 lessons. Once you realize something like that, there are 2 lessons. First, we are completely blinded to the supply chain. So clearly, if we want to plan for and respond to emergency, it's going to be a pretty big problem if we don't even know what the supply chain is, right? But there is another interesting question here, which is I think that it's fair to say that often resilience is the interest of everybody, but nobody wants to pay for it. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that I think that governments and regulators, I suspect, will have to play a far more significant role in making sure that supply chains have resilience, especially for products that have critical roles in enabling society. I don't think that the government currently has a mature way to think about it. I think that they are now aware that there is a big problem at the very least. At the very least now they understand that there is a problem. I don't think that there is a clear maturity or mature way to think about what is the role of government in making sure that the supply chain is resilient. And the last thing I want to make, a point that I want to make about this, and maybe in contrast to the example that Erez gave, there is the very famous example of Toyota that wakes up one day and the plant of the most critical the brake in the car is completely gone because of a fire. And what they do is they bring 200 of their suppliers and work together. And in a matter of a week to 2 weeks, they're back to full production. And to me, that's an example of how relationships in the supply chain provide flexibility to the supply chain to respond. And to respond quick and find solutions. Now, I think at the end of the day, when we look on what solutions we found in the context of the COVID pandemic, we found a lot of those type of solutions emerged ultimately, but it took us like 6 months to do that, right? Not 2 weeks. And that makes all the difference in the world. So the question is, one of the dimensions of flexibility in our supply chain are relationships, right? And the more transactional the supply chain is, the less hope you should have for having that type of flexibility and vice versa. So.
Thanks, Rajsep. You haven't mentioned like Toyota. Let's jump to the next question, which is about just in time. So we have had like Tesla selling cars without USB ports. I think this week we read about Ford about to ship Ford Explorers with an important part which will connect to the heating and AC. They'll give customers a discount, and these parts are coming up to 1 year from now to dealers who will then install. And BMW also have issues selling cars without touchscreens. The key question is, are we moving from just-in-time to just-in-case, or is lean manufacturing dead?
I don't think it's dead. It's probably going to be a mixed kind of, it might be going to reduce itself a bit. There will be some warehouses full of stocks close by. Maybe it's going to be on the cost of that manufacturer. Maybe it's going to be on the cost of somebody else that's willing to play the game with and sit on his own inventory. But I think it's definitely we're going to see some decline in just-in-time. We see it, of course, in the automotive industry that's suffering quite a lot, as you mentioned. And some of them now talking to us, let's open a warehouse with spare parts here or there just so we can feed up the supply. And, but even those that did just in time, a lot of the time it was just in time because of the problem in supply chain, they order more than they actually needed. So now instead of, if you can stabilize your supply chain and you keep ordering more or less the same thing, that's probably going to move closer. It will have to wait something closer to the factory, and that will be kind of a hybrid approach for the two things.
Okay, thank you.
But I think there's a portfolio aspect to this too. You know, that just in case for everything is it's not viable financially. Your CFO is not going to be happy with that.
Yep.
And because the scenario is, it's not that like you need everything to be there. It's just that one thing that you didn't think about, that you didn't know you were going to be vulnerable to, the brake pad or the circuit semiconductor. You know, it's going to be specific things, and so that's where that deeper understanding of suppliers and going beyond your tier 1 to tier 2 and tier 3 to anticipate. Like, what is the Ukraine crisis going to do in terms of, I saw nickel price going up, and I mentioned, or somebody was in the hall was talking about neon. Like, things was suddenly, that you didn't know that you were vulnerable to, that 70% of the neon in the world is in Russia and Ukraine. So how does that affect my supply chain? We don't know a lot of times. And so the more we can understand and map our supply chain, the less we'll have to carry stock of everything. Now, that's not trivial. We had an initiative trying to help map tier 2 and tier 3. It's a lot of work. And this is where it comes back to, if every company has to do this, but collectively, if the government can play a role, if there's a useful role, that helping to identify where there is more strategic vulnerability in certain supply chains, that's where, a company can't do everything for their entire supply network, but being able to target where just in time might cause you more vulnerability is something that's worth looking at, and trying to understand the inherent design and structure of our supply chains and the interdependencies that we need to be accounting for.
I want to maybe offer another perspective, complementary perspective to the issues that we just discussed, which is the product design itself. So I think that one of the issues is that we have overly complex and diversified products, and we often have in many industries lack of standardization that does not allow you to actually switch between different components of different vendors. That's a big issue in the pharmaceutical space. I think it's a big issue in other industries. So to me, there is another dimension of interventions is how do you design products that are more flexible, more modular, and how do you create a cross-industry standards that allow you the flexibility to switch from one vendor to another. And I think that that's often a very first-order limiting factor. On top of, I'm not dismissing all the issues that were brought here, but I think that if we want to think about it strategically, we want to think about all the dimensions that impact the problem. I think that the product design and standards across the industry are a first-order issue, at least in some industries. Now, we keep talking about things, but I know many companies, one solution would be, hey, let's just bring the plants and the vendors just close by, offshore. But, it might be naive to think that that's going to solve the entire problem. One of the issues that we had, and COVID actually maybe was unique in that respect, was of workforce. I mean, many companies could not just bring the workforce to work. Yeah. Or could bring less workforce to work, right? So, that connects immediately to issues like automation. How do we create more robustness to workforce shortages? That's, to me, another thing that maybe we kind of overlooked, and that's not going to be solved just by bringing the plant close to us, because if you look on Australia, you couldn't move from one city to another, right? Because of quarantine and restrictions that were imposed by the government. So I just think that COVID should make us, the experience over the last 2 years should make us think about flexibility in a far more end-to-end comprehensive manner than just, hey, just in time or just in case. And again, not to dismiss the importance of just in time and just in case.
It's interesting, we used to always talk about, when you design the product, you've built in 80% of the cost of your product. of your supply chain, right? And then we supply chain folks are dealt with, we can only change on the margins. But we hadn't, 80% of the risk is built in too. Like your ability to find other components that could fit in to replace it or other raw materials is also built in too. So that co-design of product and supply chain, has more than just a cost impact, it's also a risk impact as well.
Okay, we have 7 minutes left. Let's pick some of the questions that the audience sent. I see at least a couple of them have been answered. Let's go with this one. With everything that can go wrong, how far should you really take your business continuity plan? What would be the right level of investment? Gentlemen?
It's a tricky question. Depends who you ask, the CFO or the supply chain guys,
I
right?
ask you.
Yeah, so definitely you need to invest enough to be able to sustain for certain amount of time, depend what is your interest to sustain, 6 months, 12 months, whatever it is. Because otherwise, you will be shut down. And during COVID, a lot of smaller companies that did not invest definitely disappeared, shut down, couldn't continue. So I think that we're going to get help because a lot of VC money goes to new solutions, new ideas to improve things. But there will have to be also the local investment of the companies for ensure that they are more sustainable.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, it's really, before we mention the boundary, it depends on your boundaries that you're trying to cover as to what level investment. But it's also what kind of investment are you going to make? Building hard capacity that you will not be utilized a lot of the time is probably not the right kind of investment. But investing in your people to be able to adapt and investing in relationships or being able to map some key supply networks, that kind of investment may not be as significant monetarily, but is going to have more value over the long term. So it's not only the level, but also the type of investment you need to be thinking about.
Yeah, I would like to make 2 points. The first one, that to me, the most important question is, are you really consciously taking risks, or are you just living with risks that you are not even aware that you're taking? And I think that the latter is probably a more representative situation for many companies than the former. So the first thing, you should get to a place where you understand what the risks are, and then you make choices. But the second thing, I think once you understand the map of risks, you would be surprised by the opportunities of moderate investments with high return in terms of resilience. The physics of these systems is such that often a moderate level of investments will give you surprisingly high gains when it comes to flexibility and resilience. That's something that we know from the physics of these supply chains, these systems, and I think that not all managers are aware of that. And only when you analyze the map of risks and you understand that by this moderate investment, you actually address multiple risks, not only one. It's only then when you realize that this is not an easy task, but perhaps not the trade-off that maybe people kind of ironed in their mind of, either I'm not competitive in steady state or I have to invest in resilience. I don't think that that's necessarily the choice.
And just to relate to that too, I just was reading recently, again, reminding myself of Nighty and uncertainty. That the difference between risk and uncertainty is risk is you can put odds to it and you can then plan for it. You could look at determining the right level of investment because you have some way of understanding what the risk is. But planning for uncertainty where you can't put odds to it is the part that we've all been dealing with, and that's a different kind of planning and investment. And
you can still plan for that.
You can still do it, yeah. But it doesn't mean you don't necessarily have to know the exact risk. It's the kind of the way you would operate differently and the way you would adapt is what you learn by exploring uncertainties that you can't put odds on. So.
Excellent, thank you. Let's try it. Maybe a couple questions, Max. There was this one. Let's go with the minority. 0 votes. I love that. Is raising prices the only option to offset increased material and transportation costs? Erez, would you, industry?
I don't think so. Transportation cost is definitely something that I don't think will go down dramatically in the next 2 years. I feel that it It will go down, but not to the old days. But I think it's more important to look in how to improve supply chains that you actually can reduce your safety stocks. Because at the end of the day, there is much more money tied up in safety stock. And I think somebody earlier mentioned it, that the cost of money is actually rising right now. It's something that in the past we can't ignore it, but now you have to think about this. So that's where you can look into that and improve into that. Because there's no much option for you to reduce the transportation cost by yourself. No, I don't, it's a system. It's a complex system that no one single person here can change it. So it's much more better to look into how can I actually reduce and be much more resilient to avoid problems that will bring it even upper.
I think that if there is space where government intervention is needed, is in the shipping supply chain. Erez knows the supply chain far better than me, but it's a very broken and fragmented supply chain with very misaligned incentives. And it's not clear that the rise of cost is just a function of you need to do more, of a higher productivity. It's actually more of a sign of a lot of dysfunctional parts, misalignments, waste. And I think that the government and maybe the industry collectively, it will take, I agree with Erez, that it will take a collective effort, potentially or very likely with a heavy dose of government intervention or government's intervention, because it's not even one government problem to solve, to make sure that shipping supply chains are not becoming suddenly something that drives economies down. I mean, to some extent, we can be in a situation where disruptions in the shipping industry is going to cause inflation and potentially an economic havoc. That's not something that I think we want to have as the global level. And I think that if there is any space, there are probably multiple spaces, but that's definitely a space where I think that government interventions at one level or another like should be considered at least.
Well, then you're seeing it happen on that front. I mean, I think people saw with the port congestion and with the pandemic that this is a complex system, and a lot of parties have to come together to actually make this work. It's not just one party in the conveyance of goods. And yesterday they announced, the U.S. government announced this FLOW initiative, the Freight Logistics Optimization Works. Is that a W? They made an acronym out of it to call it FLOW. But they've got shippers, carriers, chassis providers, and it's a beginning. I don't know, who knows? They're trying to set themselves up as the honest broker to share data to start to figure out how the system works and how we can avoid the waste of independent parties planning in their own silos and make it flow a little bit better. So we'll see that if that's a beginning of some kind of collective effort to make that system less, more cost-effective and more resilient.
There is final comment, please.
Yeah, I definitely want to add up on the comments just shared here. The real reason for the supply chain rise in pricing, it's not really because there is no space on the vessels or somebody decided to bring it up. It's really, the reason of that is the bullwhip effect that happened by, let's order a lot, let's stop the orders, let's order a lot, let's rush it, let's move it, and suddenly let's sit on the cargo, let's have all these containers stuck in our either ports or warehouses, and let's take the chassis that does not available anymore. So you need to suddenly produce much more containers at origin. You need to find chassis out of nowhere. It's the whole system created a panic up and down, and that's basically what's bringing it up. So it needs to be looked at the overall system rather than one thing that caused the whole thing up.
Thank you. Well, time is up. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Thanks for your questions, the virtual audience, those here. If you are interested in getting to know more about REDSAF work, the Operational Research Center, check them out or talk to your program director at the ILP. Same thing from Jarrod at CTL. You can check them out online or talk to one of us. We're very happy to connect you to the researchers. And thank you, Erez. Thank you, Jarrod. Thank you, REDSAF. And we're heading out to our last talk, right? Thank you.